Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Taricani lecture series. We are so excited to have you all here. We are going to be talking about what is happening with coverage and in the elections, in the aftermath of the elections. But first, we want to show you this video from the Harrington School.
At URI's Harrington School of Communication and Media, every day is an exploration.
With global learning opportunities
and high-profile internships,
Harrington prepares us to be critical media consumers
and creative media producers
in the rapidly changing 21st century marketplace.
in strategic communications,
in multimedia journalism,
In sports media,
in writing and rhetoric,
in information analytics,
in digital media, film, and TV.
Our tight-knit learning community is tailored to build a solid foundation
for powerful creative communication,
and a lifetime of achievement and opportunity,
wherever our passions lead. Discovery, opportunity, impact.
The Harrington School of Communication and Media at the University of Rhode Island.
Visit today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sri Srinivasan, and I'm an honorary member of the URI family. I am honored to welcome everyone to the third 2020 Taricani Lecture on First Amendment Rights. Jim Tarakan was a veteran Rhode Island journalist and nationally respected investigative reporter for nearly 4 decades with WJAR-TV and a valued member of the URI family. When Jim passed in 2019, his wife, Lori White, and family and friends came together to create the Taricani Lecture Series to ensure that Jim's legacy lives on through keeping the focus on the First Amendment for journalists and the health of our democracy, and helping to educate our journalists in training at the Harrington School. It is now my honor to welcome our friend and University of Rhode Island alumna, Lori White.
Thank you very much, Sri, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to join with all of you to present the third part in our Taricani lecture series. We were very honored and blessed to be able to feature Nick Kristof on the first go-around earlier this summer. And then later on in the season, we were able to connect with URI alum Christian Amanpour. And together with a group of local leaders here as well, we've been able to do a deep dive into a lot of the issues that Jim cared so deeply about around the First Amendment and reporters' privilege and truth and trust in journalism. And in particular, also educating the next wave of journalists, both print and broadcast, to be responsible journalists in today's society. So this is a very important project for me, for our entire family, and we are just so thrilled and deeply grateful to President David Dooley, the president of the University of Rhode Island, for being a partner with us for so many years on so many issues here in Rhode Island, and also Dean Jen Riley from the URI Harrington School of Communication. She is the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Rhode Island. So we are here today with part 3 of our lecture in the first year of doing this in the aftermath of Jim's passing. And I thought it would be really fitting today to bring together a local perspective and to bring together a group of people for whom Jim was most proud, and these were his colleagues that he felt most attached to during his many years in journalism, 40 years, and friends and people that were just so enriching to his life personally and professionally. So I'd like to thank M. Charles Bakst, his longtime friend and colleague from the Providence Journal, with whom they shared many interesting stories and opportunities and many breakfasts along the way and lots of note comparing. So Charlie, thank you so much. Also Katie Davis and Parker Gavigan, Jim's colleagues and now Jim's successors, running the NBC 10 I team and doing it with such great aplomb. And also Dyana Koelsch. And Dyana Koelsch was Jim's first I team partner and very, very dear friend, and later became a business partner with Jim as they went off and did other things outside of media. So the four of them were extremely, extremely important parts of Jim's life. And that's why I thought it would be extremely important to bring them here today. And also like to truly thank Dan Barry from the New York Times, who was present at Jim's funeral last year and also led a procession of journalists who were important to him and were able to, again, focus on the role of the press and the First Amendment. So pleased to be here with all of you to join this lecture. And at this point, let me just say a couple of words about Dan. And I'm happy to introduce Dan. He is the longtime New York Times reporter and columnist. And Dan Barry, as many of you may know, was a member of the Providence Journal investigative team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 1994 for exposing corruption in the state court system. And he has twice been a Pulitzer Prize finalist with the New York Times for coverage of Hurricane Katrina and the Great Recession. And he is also the author of 5 books, including This Land, America Lost and Found. And that is a collection of his national This Land columns. So thank you, Dan, for being with us today, and welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great to have you here, Dan. And thank you, Lori. A reminder to everyone, please hit share right now if you're watching on Facebook or on Twitter or on YouTube. We want your family and friends to be able to watch live or later. Please post your comments. And also, please tell us where you're watching from. We'll use your questions and your comments first in this section with Dan Barry, and then with our great Rhode Island journalists as well. So we want to hear from you. The hashtag we're using is hashtag URI Taricani. So first, Dan, thank you for being here. And this is a homecoming of sorts for you in Rhode Island. My first question is to tell us your kind of thoughts on the coverage of this election, which appears to be still going on.
What election, Sri, are you referring to? I think the coverage has been quite sound. Whether there were mistakes in anticipation of the election and certain assumptions that were made, that's also perhaps part of the conversation. But the coverage has been, I thought, remarkable. I'm obviously going to boost the New York Times' coverage, which is every day had a special section dedicated specifically to the election and covering every nook and cranny and development in what's been happening in this most extraordinary, protracted election.
And what are some things that I know you're not a political reporter, but you certainly have observations about this moment?
I think that the media will continue to have to self-examine. Okay, so we went through this period in 2016 where the polls apparently misread the country and much of the media, and I might have been as guilty of that as anybody. I was wandering the country. I wasn't writing about politics. And it wasn't until the end of 2016, around October, that I saw Confederate flags in Pennsylvania. And as I recall, Pennsylvania was not part of the Confederacy, but it was saying something else. And I didn't really follow up on that. Now in 2020, you think that the media would have learned its lesson, or their lesson, the polling would have been different. And yet again, the polls and the coverage leading up to the election were suggesting an outcome that wasn't what it turned out to be, in part because the polling was not recognizing the votes or the inclinations of people of Latino descent. And not that that's not a block, Latino covers a lot. And so we missed how the people in Miami and how people in the Imperial Valley in California felt. Also how the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign's trying to describe the Democrats as socialists and communists, that found traction among people who had come from countries where there had in fact been dictatorships or authoritarian governments. So with some exceptions, including a couple of my colleagues, Jenny Medina and Patricia Mazzei, we largely, I think, missed that. But I think that the coverage, Sri, of the election, and also the refusal to give too much air to allegations of election fraud without evidence has been a shining moment for the media.
And one of the things that we are all watching right now is how the accusations of election fraud are causing kind of the standstill in parts of what should be happening with the transition. Let's talk a little bit about the process of polling. Your colleague, Nate Cohn, who does a lot of the polling at the New York Times, said that the mistakes the New York Times and others the mistakes the polling got wrong in the calculations they got wrong in 2016 were even worse this time. But because the Biden lead was so was strong enough to kind of counter that, what would have happened to polling if in fact it had been completely wrong, not just the directionally wrong, but the amount, if it had been in fact that Trump had won?
Well, I'm not a pollster, right? And I think you're right that Nate did say that this was worse, because it felt a little bit like fool me once, shame on me. But I don't know how to answer that, Sri. I think that it's become an existential. First of all, Nate was saying this morning that it's a little too early to do the forensic examination, that the body laying across America is still warm. But I think that in the future, it's going to be, all right, what are we going to do differently? I mean, the reality is that maybe you noticed this too. I would watch the news and they would show a poll result from, say, Iowa or from some other state. And at the very bottom in very small lettering, it would say that the sample was 750 people or 643 people. And I think that journalists of their worth would know you have to have a larger sample than that. I mean, at least 1,000. That's what I would remember, to suggest that this is what an entire state is saying based on a sampling of 743 people or what have you is a mistake. Also, the recognition that people don't necessarily want to tell a polling service the truth. And part of that is because of President Trump's constant beating the drum of a fake media or a fake news, that there's an agenda at play here. So if you ascribe to the Trump worldview and you get a call from someone polling for the New York Times, are you going to tell them the truth? Also, they were not, I think, and Nate was pointing this out as well, that for some reason they were not capturing in their polling people of Latino descent, certainly not enough.
And this is some of the things, I guess, that we will now adjust going forward. Let's look at some of the comments coming in, and everyone would love for you to participate. Dean Jen Riley says, welcome from the Harrington School of Communication and Media. URI alumni, tell us where you're watching from on your major and graduation year. I know we'd all love to hear where you're watching from. Jackie Sawyer Noel is watching from Charlestown, and Carla is watching from Belfast, Northern Ireland. Iwa is watching from Narragansett. Carla says, my mom is seeing Confederate flags in California. Never saw them there growing up. What does that say about this country? You mentioned the flags in Pennsylvania.
You know, it suggests to me an ominous schism. Now, there's always been divide in this country, and that's what's made the country great. There is a divide. There are opposing opinions, and then every 4 years, there's some resolution about the direction for the country for the next 4 years. But I'm not saying anything that is fresh anymore about the deepening divide. And so when I see the Confederate flag flying in Pennsylvania, I'm seeing someone willing to go back to that Civil War mentality, us versus them, Democrats versus Republicans, rural versus urban. And the problem, now you could go 100 years ago, if you look at, say, the election of 1924, some of the same dynamics were at play, that urban-rural tension that was at play. Now, though, the news sources are many, and not all of them, as Margaret Sullivan of the Washington Post points out, are reality-based. Okay, so people are not relying, say, on major newspapers and 3 networks any longer. There are many, many, many news sources, and not all of them are honorable. And so Facebook and Twitter can never catch up. This is extraordinary, isn't it? Facebook and Twitter can never catch up with the avalanche of lies and misinformation that are being placed on their platforms to the detriment of the health of this republic. So so when I see a Confederate flag, I have flashbacks of 1861.
And that is so scary to hear that. Folks, you're listening to a conversation with the great Dan Barry. Please post your comments and post your questions. We have a few more minutes with him, and then we'll go on to our panel. Let's look at who else is watching. Janet's watching, class of 1979. May Kernan is here. Sharon is sociology and an MBA. And Jim is saying greetings from Cranston. We also have Steve is watching on YouTube from Tallahassee, and watching from Hillside Hall is Hannah. So lots of folks joining us from all over. Thank you all for being here. And please share this with your friends and family. They can watch live or they can watch it later. Dan, in terms of that autopsy metaphor that we heard this morning.
It's very pretty, isn't it? Very lovely.
Yeah, the idea that this is too soon, but there are things that we can learn about this country. If the elections in this country are usually a referendum on the sitting president, how do you judge the 71 million people who looked at these last 10 months at least, or 7 months, and said, I want more of this, let alone the previous 3.5 years?
Right. So as we sit here, it's more than 75 million people voted for Joseph Biden, and more than 71 million people voted for Donald Trump. So it would be easy to categorize those people in a certain way, that they also embody some of the lesser characteristics of the president, meaning, the bullying that he did, the flirting with racism as he did, referring to the vice president-elect as a monster. That would be a mistake. 71 million people in this country do not feel entirely the way he does. I think what we see is people embracing his economic policies most of all. And I think it's easy, as I think was said on the Daily today, and I think Nate Cohn said it, it's one thing for someone who's making more than $200,000 a year saying, I will vote for comedy in this country over the economy. I will vote for bringing us together over the economy, but I'm making more than $200,000 a year. If I'm making $20,000 a year or $30,000 a year, I may have an entirely different perspective about the importance of the economy, about putting food on the table. And so loftier thoughts, I'm not saying they're not important, but the idea of coming together as a country, this kind of abstract but essential belief, may not carry as much weight for someone who's just living paycheck to paycheck.
Thank you. Kathy is watching and on Facebook, and Janet is watching from North Central Pennsylvania, where there are lots of Confederate flags and have been for many years, unfortunately. And Janet did child development and family relations and elementary education. In terms of, we hear a lot about the national media. Of course, there's a lot of focus on what's happening on CNN and MSNBC and Fox. But I want you to talk about local journalism. Why does it matter? Why is it important?
Okay, so first of all, as people are calling in or signaling that they're watching the program, I'm thinking that certainly in Rhode Island that I have datelines from every one of those towns, Cranston, Westerly. I've been there. And I'm a huge supporter of local news. And I wrote a story a couple of months ago about effectively the last reporter in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, working for a once proud 2 Pulitzer winning newspaper. Why it matters? Why does it matter? Right? Why does it matter? Well, it matters because it's at the very, very foundation of the republic that you have an informed electorate. There's no getting around this, okay? You need an informed electorate. So if you take away the newspaper, which, I have to say is traditionally, the newspapers would be the ones who would be sitting, struggling to stay awake at the Board of Education meeting, okay? Or the Zoning Board of Appeals meeting, okay? Now, if you take away those reporters, you don't have someone sitting in those rooms, and what's being decided in those rooms directly affects you. It directly affects your taxes. And some councilman or some Zoning Board of Appeal Commission member is going to move up. That person is going to become the state legislator, okay? That person is going to then perhaps run for Congress or run for governor. All of this matters. And so in the old days, you would have Q&A with every candidate for every town council seat, for every Board of Ed seat. They would have to answer a series of questions, and there would be a profile of them. No one's doing that anymore. So you don't even know who these candidates are oftentimes, and you're relying on the nonsense that you're seeing on Facebook, which is misinformed. And so if you don't have an informed electorate, it affects government, and it puts the republic in jeopardy. That's my feeling.
Thank you.
I feel strongly about it, as you can tell.
Yeah, I can tell. Kelly is watching, and Kelly asks, what do you think the role of the media will be as President Trump is not yet conceded as we talk now?
So is the question about what will happen between now and the inauguration? In other words,
and the media's role in that process. What would what would you be looking to pay attention to? How does the media cover this?
I think they cover it the way that they have been covering the last few days. Okay, and that is you have numbers in favor of the declaration of a winner, that being Joe Biden. And now you have the incumbent who is refusing to concede and is throwing out, and his lackeys are throwing out these unfounded allegations of voter fraud around the country. They're basically seeing what will stick. And so if you noticed Fox News yesterday, Neil Cavuto, who, by the way, went to St. Bonaventure University in my class, the press secretary of the White House was having a press conference, though I think she was wearing a different hat as a campaign spokesperson. And she was basically saying the same kinds of things, these allegations of voter fraud, without one iota of evidence. And Neil Cavuto on the Fox network cut it off, said he could not in good countenance allow this to happen. So the answer to the question would be the same kind of rigor, the same kind of allowing to explain what is going on, but not to further misinformation that does no good.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left with Dan. Well, we're seeing lots of questions coming in. Kathy says, so for the future journalists on the line who could be working as journalists in 2024, what is the biggest learning for them from this election cycle to keep in mind?
From this election cycle? I don't know if there's, I would say it's the same lesson. Don't you think, Sri? It's the same same principles of journalism, okay? To investigate every aspect of the issue, hear both sides of the situation, but not be caught up in false equivalency. If you say something that is fact-based about me, and I come back and just make some kind of effective slander about you, that the reporter understands the difference and gives the proper weight to the evidence and the facts rather than to the rhetoric. I think that we if we didn't know it before, we certainly learned that lesson in 2020.
All right. Before you go, I want to show everyone an article that you wrote, a column, a beautiful column you wrote. We're going to put that on the screen here. A reporter for whom burn in hell meant a job well done. This is an article, of course, about Jim Tarakan. Tell us about this piece and talk about Jim a little bit, please.
Sure, it'd be an honor. So at his funeral, I was one of several dozen journalists who formed an honor guard for the casket, and that it was really an expression of love, of course, but also respect for this singular journalist and this champion of First Amendment rights. All right, and I will tell you that, having competed with him for several years, I both hated and loved him in a way, okay? And it's interesting, and I wrote this in the piece, that in the Providence Journal newsroom at 6 o'clock in the evening, it would get quiet because we wanted to know, what did Taricani and Koelsch have this time, okay? What did we miss? And so I covered, I was the Boswell of organized crime for the Providence Journal for a while. I knew more about patriarchy than I did about my own father for a while. Jim and I covered RISDIC. No one listening here probably remembers that credit union scandal, or the Supreme Court scandals of the early to mid 90s. And whenever I knew that Jim was working on the same story that I was working on, I took pride. I was glad, because it meant that my news judgment was sound, because I knew how sound Jim Tarakani's news judgment was. And beyond being a fierce competitor, he was just a genuinely good and generous man who mentored many people quietly. And he really, really left his mark, I will tell you that.
Well, that's so special to hear that, Dan. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time here today. Tell us what you're going to be looking at in yourself in the next 70-something days.
There's this other issue that's going on. It's called COVID. And so for the last several months, I've been working on a project out of Elmhurst, Queens, which was for a while the epicenter of the coronavirus, and what the impact of the virus was on this incredibly diverse community where there are more than 200 languages being spoken. So I'm focused on that. I'm trying to get my editors to let me write about Four Seasons total landscaping, just because I think that needs a forensic analysis of, like, how the heck did that happen? I don't know if they'll bite, though.
Well, we laugh because they otherwise would be crying all day. There's so much going on, so much pain. But thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for all your work and your support of the Taricani Lecture Series by being here today.
It's an honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, folks, we are getting ready for our panel. And let me tell you who's on our panel today. We have a terrific program where we will be hearing from journalists from Rhode Island. Katie Davis and Parker Gavigan are investigative reporters with WJAR-TV. Longtime political columnist M. Charles Bakst is here, now retired, was a longtime political columnist for the Providence Journal. And Dyana Koelsch, a URI alumna, was a print and broadcast news reporter for 2 decades and now is a public relations professional. They will explore such timely topics as the role of the media in covering the election, The journalist's dual duties as educator of the public, especially in times of crisis, and as watchdog of government officials, and the importance of the First Amendment in their work. So let's welcome this extraordinary panel. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. We're really grateful to you all. I'm going to, since Dyana was mentioned in Dan's remarks, I'd love for Dyana to reflect a little bit on what Dan said and also talk a little bit about what you're observing of the election coverage.
Well, I will say that my thoughts reflect much of what he said about Jim, and I would be remiss if I didn't kind of pile on that one, because I was one of those people that was mentored by him. And I think an important thing I was thinking about was always when he did stories, and we did stories together, they weren't always favorable, as you can guess, and political campaigns, even locally, aren't always, our coverage wasn't always favorable. But the feedback that we consistently got was that we got thanked for our stories, even if we did a negative story. So people would say, well, I didn't come across that well, but thank you for being fair. And I'm concerned that the public's trust right now has diminished to that. And I'd be interested in what Katie and Parker have to say about that, because I just anecdotally from people that I know, all they want to do is badmouth the media, and they blame the media for not reporting things that are positive to them. Their expectation seems to be, if you do a story that uncovers something, that you somehow are targeting folks. So I'm a little troubled by that from a local perspective.
All right. Thank you very much, Dyana. Let's go to Charlie. Charlie, how are you doing? Thank you for being here. Your thoughts on what Dan had to say and your own observations, please.
Nice to see you. It's an honor to be here. Jim was a very good friend of mine, and it always struck me, particularly in later years, he was so tough and so famous, and yet personally he was very shy, and he didn't. I liked being a celebrity to the extent that I was a celebrity with my picture in the paper and so on. But I would meet him for breakfast, and he'd be sitting in the corner, and he did not crave publicity. Let me put it that way. He's very low key like that. I had some thoughts listening to Dan. I thought he was a little tough on the polls when he seemed to suggest, okay, well, they got it wrong again. But think about it. They said Biden was going to win, and Biden did win. They said Biden would carry Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Georgia, and Arizona, and he did. I think some of this is illusionary in that it took so long to count the votes because of the email, and it seemed like it was really, suspenseful and drawn out. But I think that Biden won by enough of a margin. I thought that the one reason there might have been a problem with the polls is I remember in the last few days when everybody was reporting that they showed Biden ahead, the Trump people would say, well, no, you're underestimating our get out the vote capability, the organizational aspect of it. And I think that it turned out to have some truth to it. And I think that's going to be a challenge for reporters in the future. And by the way, even though the newspapers and the television stations and so on were reporting that Biden was ahead, nobody said, okay, well, we're not going to cover Trump anymore. He got tremendous coverage for his rallies and so forth. And I do think that the media did a very good job during the campaign of labeling lies as lies, and saying that Trump was saying this and that without foundation. But I think this is a real challenge for the mainstream media. I think Dan touched on it a little bit. No matter how much the networks and the leading newspapers and so on report the truth, it's hard to get the truth into the heads of people who are members of a cult, which is the way I categorize many of the Trump people. And I say that because the television would go and interview some of these people at rallies. First of all, of course, nobody had masks on or whatever.
And when you would say to one of these rally attendants, what are you doing here without masks? Whether aren't you worried about the coronavirus? And they say, oh, that's all a hoax. I don't know how you get through to people like that. I'd be interested to hear what the other people have to say.
Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate your comments. Let me go to Katie to talk a little bit about her view as an investigative reporter, as a member of that I-team.
I think Dyana made such a great point when it comes to people at home not necessarily having the trust in the media. And I even hesitate to use that phrase, the media, right? Because they're putting so many groups who are not journalists into that same group when folks at home might be saying that. And I think we've seen that lately. I know myself and Parker, we've had viewers reaching out to us, asking us to investigate what they think is election fraud. When we look into it, that's not accurate. There's not actually even the possibility of fraud. And then sometimes they'll say, well, you guys won't investigate it because you've been paid off. Which, just think about that. How crazy is that to think that we as local reporters in Rhode Island would have somehow been paid off by like a national organization to not investigate something? It's just kind of mind-blowing, but that is kind of the mindset of some folks that are out there. And Rhode Island is a very blue state, but that's certainly not to say that it's monolithic. When you look at all 39 cities and towns that we have some cities and towns that went 60% for President Trump. So really, when you're covering a region as a local journalist, you know, just how the entire state votes is not indicative of all the communities within that state. And I know Dan knows this well, having covered Rhode Island for many years. It's so different depending where you go, in Massachusetts as well.
Thank you, Katie. Let's go to Patrick and get his thoughts. Patrick? Oh, sorry, Parker. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Parker.
It's all right. People either call me Patrick or Gavin, so you got one of them.
Let me do it right. Parker Gavigan, I-team reporter, WJAR-TV.
Thank you, Sri. Thank you. No, I think, you know, you could see this coming in 2016 when the president first ran, and you know, just this rhetoric from him, this adversarial position against the media. From an early stage, and you know, the chance of fake news. You know, I shun to think of it because it's so troubling as a reporter. You know, and of course, locally we're not covering the race nationally, but you look at all of the hardworking folks who are out there just doing their jobs as reporters at these rallies across the country, and it starts from the top with the president's rhetoric, and that of course has trickled down to the average folks and people that, you know, we might encounter out on the street. I think, you know, my lesson really from this election, it was really different because obviously we had a presidential election going on amid a pandemic, and what really changed for me, I saw my role in the election as really being an informative reporter. We had so many deadlines. Obviously, the influx of mail ballots. I mean, more than 100,000 people in Rhode Island voted before the election by mail. This was unprecedented, right? So we just had, you know, we had so many things changing. People needed to be informed about deadlines, about registrations. How do they do this? How do they? We hadn't really traversed this landscape before, and I think voters were very confused. In the past, you just show up on election day and vote. You know, a very minimal amount of folks do so beforehand by mail ballot. So it seemed like every day, every week, there were you know, different directions that we needed to go in and inform the public. Hey, this is what you need to do. Especially like, for instance, I remember the week before the election. What if you were told by the health department that you needed to quarantine, but you planned on voting in person? Now, what do you do? So I just remember, you know, just taking this role with, okay, here are some problems, inherent problems. that people are going to encounter? How do we help them get through this?
Thank you very much for that. We have lots of alumni watching, of course. Please tell us the year you graduated and where you're watching from. But I also want to tell everyone that we have at least one applicant who's hoping to be a freshman in the fall, who's already applying. I guess this is admission season and the deadlines are coming up. And so next year, Cole Gibney hopes to be part of the URI family. Let's keep looking at some of the comments coming in here. Bonnie Kinchner says, in Newport, we definitely have a robust vetting of candidates through efforts of the Alliance for a Livable Newport, the League of Women Voters, and local news outlets. That combination is important. Bob Anthony says, watching Neil Cavuto, a Fox anchor, cut off Kayleigh McEnany was nothing short of astounding, a win for good journalism. Dan Barry had pointed this out. I will say that that was an interesting moment, but Neil Cavuto has a history of pushing back on occasion. If you watch the rest of the Fox lineup that night, you wouldn't have seen anything close to any pushback. Carla, URI alum, Comms 98, watching this election evolve while living abroad is frustrating and perplexing. So exhausted debunking the many unsubstantiated claims people are seeing and sharing across social media platforms and also some news media like Fox. And Vandana is watching in New York City. Kathleen says, I teach communication and rhetoric at URI. Could you, aimed at whoever will respond, speak to the role of language in shaping voter perspective? So let's start with Charlie, and then we'll go to Dyana with that.
Well, I don't know exactly whose language you're talking about. If you listen to Trump, very often the commentators or the reporters will report to you right away that he's lying, and he uses this inflammatory language even before the voting. He was claiming that everything would be rigged and so on. So I think it's incumbent, and it was increasingly the case this year, that when somebody lies, the reporters and the commentators say it's a lie. I still, Katie made a comment earlier about people calling the station and saying, well, why aren't you reporting this? Why aren't you reporting that? That really, and I'm sure she's right, and it troubles me. How do you get through to people like that? These people, why don't you count the votes? Why is there voter fraud? Well, there isn't voter fraud. It's the president says it, and then these echo chamber websites and Fox News to some extent repeats it, and then people out there believe it.
Dyana, your thoughts?
Well, so I would say that I think that there has become an elevated level of rhetoric, for sure, and propaganda. And I think that it is seeping in some ways into not just the columnist or the candidates or Fox News, or even CNN or any of the folks who are talking about the election cycle. I think that the American public, and I think a lot of folks even locally, have a hard time sifting through, like, who's giving their opinion and who's reporting facts. And journalists, most of the time, are reporting facts and not giving their own opinion about those facts or their analysis of the facts. And that line has blurred so much that it's even hard. I'll turn on CNN. I have trouble thinking, okay, is that a columnist, or is that a talk guy, or is he a journalist? Is he telling me what he thinks, or is he telling me? And I think when Charlie was a columnist for the Providence Journal, he would give his opinion, but his opinion was based on his political analysis. And it wasn't just spewing kind of lies or substantiating falsehoods that were said. I also wanted to just say one thing about the media, and I think that we've always been kind of the gatekeeper on what the public got to see and hear. And that has changed a lot now with the social media. So, it just kind of comes into people's heads immediately. And so there is no gatekeeper. So it just floods in, like Dan was saying. And I think that there's a real loss of that. There's nobody kind of saying, okay, you talk about the Fox saying we're not going to, cutting in, and the networks cut in on President Trump's speech. And I wasn't bothered by that. I know a lot of people were. But if you're not the gatekeeper, the public is just totally overwhelmed and they don't know who to believe. And I think that is a real danger, I think, in our journalism and what's going on with journalism today.
Thank you. Parker, how do you make sure you're able to kind of be the kind of journalist and that the word language you're using to not be a columnist, not be an opinionated person? But I know both you and Katie as investigative reporters have a little bit of extra leeway because you're often making, direct, pointing out direct problems in a way that reporters sometimes have to, other kinds of reporters have to do on the one hand, on the other hand kind of thing. So your thoughts, Parker?
Yeah, well, look, on the local level, we just play right down the middle. I mean, it's just the tenets of journalism, right? Balanced and fair. But I would agree with what Dyana was saying. I mean, people think that determination between the talking head on CNN versus the reporter on the White House lawn, they can't distinguish that Sean Hannity is a commentator and not a reporter. So that is problematic, and again that flows to us also on the local level. But I think obviously we work for a cherished organization here at WJAR at Channel 10, and I think that's not lost on us as well. There's that weight and that burden that we get it right, and that we report the facts.
Okay, Katie, to you.
I think language is so important to answer that question. For instance, when we see people protesting, talking about count every legal vote. Well, of course, that makes total sense, right? We want to count every legal vote. But when you get that language, it's also presupposing that there are illegal votes, right? If you count every legal vote and putting that in a headline, it's kind of saying, well, there's illegal votes there, right? It's kind of making that assumption. So I think language is so important. Also, to Parker's point about commentators versus journalists, I explain to people who contact us with story ideas, okay, you submitted this video to us or you gave us a tip about something. Here's the process I have to go through before we could, potentially put something on television. We don't just get information, put it on television. That's not how it works. We have to verify it. Are there documents? We have to get those. Are there records related to this? So I try to explain that to people when they contact us. And most of the time they're really surprised. They don't realize, oh, you have to do all these steps. And I don't know if that's because, the waters have become so muddied in terms of who is a commentator, who is a blogger, who just has a YouTube channel, versus, who is part of a news organization that has standards and practices for what they publish and when they publish it. So I try to educate people about that as much as I can. But then, sometimes you have those people who they have their beliefs and you're not going to change them. Like the person who called and said, Channel 10 had been paid off not to report on fraud. I don't really know what to tell that person. Obviously, that's not true, but I don't know that I'm going to change his mind. But I think the language that you use is so important.
Thank you very much. We've got lots of comments coming in. Folks, please tell us where you're watching from. And if you're affiliated with URI, tell us your graduation year and major as well. Melissa and Steve are both watching together. Isn't that class of 80? And Norbert asks, a lot of media, even if they're critical of Trump, have given him tremendous exposure. What was the impact of that? For example, the chopper talk. And in the 2016 cycle, you might remember even the empty podium got more attention and more live coverage than when Jeb Bush was speaking at the exact same moment. Dyana, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that you have to cover the president, of course. So yes, he's going to get a lot of exposure, and he's going to get a lot of exposure as a candidate. I think the upshot of it is I think that Trump's exposure and his rallying of his supporters, and his exposure when he starts with the name calling and with the kind of I do believe bullying type of attitude towards people. And also his dumping on the media. I mean, the media was an enemy of his, and not just, I say media meaning journalists. He thought of them as enemies, and I think that really hurt journalists in general. I think he got people to believe that journalists were bad people or were trying to had some ulterior motive. I don't know. You have to give exposure to a candidate. He was the candidate, and he's a sitting president. I don't know how you get around that. And I think that, sure, it helps him because when it's almost like talking to the people who already support him, it just gave them more and gave them more permission to continue with some of the tactics that I've found distasteful.
Thank you, Charlie. Over to you.
The news media are the enemy of the people. We are the people. That's the way that I used to go around, used to do my job, that I was a representative of the people. I must say that a lot of the politicians didn't appreciate it that way. I once had a conversation with a fellow named Bill Bulger, who'd been president of the Massachusetts Senate. And he wrote a book, and I went to interview him about it. And he was well known for not wanting to talk to reporters. And I said to him, well, you know, you're a legislator, and I'm representing your constituents. When I ask you a question, I'm representing your constituents. And he said, no, boy wonder, I represent my constituents. So it can be a tricky thing sometimes. But the way I figured it is these politicians come and go. The arrogant ones like Nick Mattiello, who's the speaker here, who finally got defeated in his own district. Some of them lined up in jail. Some of them just disgrace and embarrass the other legislators, and they wear out their welcome. And I took the attitude, look, the Providence Journal goes on forever. That was my attitude. Now I have to say it's a shadow of the former self. But and there's no political columnist there. Nobody has the job that I used to. And even if somebody did, there wouldn't be enough room in the paper. The paper's so thin. But I must say one good thing about it that's still there. As a matter of fact, it's an improvement since I was there. Alan Rosenberg, the top editor, writes a column every Sunday that often explains to people what do we mean by this fake news? How can you tell fake news from real news? Why did we cover this or why we didn't cover that? That's the kind of thing that Katie was talking about. And in the New York Times in recent years, they've been running that piece on page 2 that interviews some of the reporters or editors about how things get into the paper or not get into the paper. I think anything like that is very useful.
Thank you, Charlie. I want to ask our two I-Team folks, do you see politicians trying to do or learning things from the Trump way in terms of dealing with reporters? Do you see local officials who feel like this is the new way of politics? Talk about that a little bit, please. Parker first.
You know, that is one of my fears when I saw the president's behavior early on and how he treated reporters. I thought, wow, will this catch on? Will local politicians take a page out of his playbook? I can't say that I've seen that locally. Maybe Katie might have a different perspective on that, but I haven't seen it locally. But it is a fear that you can, treat reporters, and to Charlie's point, we are an extension of our viewers and readers and constituents ourselves. But I have not been treated like that, like the president has treated national reporters by any local candidates.
Katie?
I would agree. I haven't seen anything that extreme. I will say sometimes I think certain politicians will go right to social media or sometimes to talk radio because they know that Channel 10 is not going to air something unsubstantiated or blow something up without evidence or proof or someone going on the record about it. So I think sometimes they go for a workaround there, but I have not seen like the wholesale antagonism or name calling or those kinds of things here locally, thankfully.
Okay. There are lots more questions coming in, folks. Thank you so much for staying with us. Please tag your friends right now on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. They can watch us live or later. We're using the hashtag URI Taricani. And you can also hit share or retweet so that your friends can watch. This is such an important conversation. We have a question from Jim who asks, do journalists need to take on the added responsibility of educating the public about media literacy? And how do you do that? So that's a big question here. Dyana, your thoughts?
My answer would be yes. I think journalists do need to do that. The question I have is the public interested, or will they even watch? Certainly programs like this are one of the ways that we can educate. I think that journalists are tied to some limitations, however, because they only can, there's, like Charlie pointed out, there's only so many pages in the newspaper left, and there's only so many articles and columns and op-eds that are allowed in. The broadcast media has only so much time to fill their newscasts with. So I think education and information has always been one of the mandates of a journalist. I think that in some ways we've gotten away from that just because of the limitations and the ability for people to go elsewhere.
Okay, Charlie, your thoughts on this?
Me, as I was listening about Trump calling the media the enemy of the people and all that stuff. The problem that I used to run into is that the people, particularly in the legislature, sometimes governors, sometimes members of Congress, would just stop talking to you. And their allies might stop talking to you. And it could be very frustrating. I can remember, for example, with the Senate leaders, you'd be looking around for them, and they would come in at the very last minute when the session was about to start. And when the session was ending, they just barrel out of there. And I can remember saying to one of them once, Rocco Quattrochi, name that some people will remember. I'd say, can't you just stand here for a minute like a human being and talk to me? And he said, no. And he just, that was the attitude of a lot of these people. But as I say, in a way, it made my job, although it made it more difficult, it gave me sort of a spark to keep going, like it was a challenge for me.
Katie, in your work, do you see a role that media literacy can play for kind of the improvement of understanding journalism?
I definitely think so. I think just, explaining to viewers, as I was saying, the process that we go through and, just the difference between, especially with social media, right? Anybody can tweet anything or put out anything. And we've even done some stories about misinformation leading up to the election, letting folks know about like deep fake videos, for instance, right? A lot of people don't know that this is a thing that, you could make anything appear real in some ways. So sometimes when we do those kind of stories leading up to an election, it helps to educate people. I think that is part of our responsibility. Maybe it didn't used to be because we just didn't have some of the players in the sphere of media that we do now. But I think we need to keep it in mind, and if we take the time to educate viewers when possible, hopefully that helps with some of it. But yeah, to Charlie's point, sometimes there are those folks that are going to cut you off or not give you interviews, or sometimes you're going to pay a price for certain things. And, Jim would say that's part of the job, or maybe even that's something to be proud of.
I want to ask Parker about the idea that, the way you do investigative journalism today, even in the last couple of years, it's changed. What would Jim and his colleagues from an earlier era think about the way you have to operate now and you have to do your work?
Well, social media has certainly changed the landscape so drastically. I know Jim in his retirement years, he gravitated toward it. He loved it. He loved Twitter after he was working, retired. but it has changed the landscape because, in Jim's day, news was broken on the 6 o'clock news. Now it can be broken on Twitter or on Facebook. And so the rapid pace of journalism has changed via social media. And it's made our job even that more difficult because, look, you want to get it right. And you want to make sure that you're reporting facts. And so while you might have had hours before, now you might have minutes. So it's just an increased pressure on a reporter's role and to get it right.
Thank you. I'm just going to read a couple of more of the comments and questions that come in, but we're out of time. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a final thought, but I will ask you to incorporate some of the comments and the questions that have come in as well. So let's take a look. Carla says, how do we combat fake news and disinformation on social media? Innovate URI. What role can and should journalists play to help consumers become smarter about what we're reading? Laura is watching from Bridgewater, class of 2008. Can you explain how journalists share news as well as far as verifying information goes? So a lot of questions around that. And we have some others as well. So if you can just give us a kind of final thought and what people should keep in mind as they're watching the news unfold over the next 75 days or so, and then ahead with the Biden administration and of course the local coverage as well. So we'll start with Katie and then go to Charlie.
I think Charlie made such a great point about explaining to people or politicians or whoever it is that you are part of the community as well. I always like to tell people that, I pay taxes as well. I'm a mom too. I'm concerned about COVID and kids going back to school. I share these concerns that you have, and I'm a real person. I'm not a bot on Twitter that's posting fake news all day. That's not what I do. I think that goes a long way on the local level. And then again, just explaining to people, okay, if you're going to send us a tip, especially a lot of the tips that come via social media, we're going to need to verify that. Are there records related to that? Are there documents? Who's going to go on the record? Explain that to them over and over. And just try to make the process clear. Try to be transparent about what we do and how we do it, and be as upfront as you can. And my hope is that the interactions that we have with people in the community in small ways can help people maybe see through some of that, fake news phrase that gets thrown around, that we are real people and we put real consideration into the stories that we do and the decisions that we make within each story.
Thank you. And folks, Katie Davis has been our guest, and she's on Twitter, NBC10_Katie. Let's go to Charlie Bakst.
Well, I'm haunted by some comments that Dan Barry made early in the program here, where he talked about the decline of local newspapers, and that piece he wrote about Pottstown, Pennsylvania was terrific. The Providence Journal today is only a shadow of what it was when I was there. It's owned by this evil company that used to be called, now it's called Gannett. The Providence Journal, the Newport Daily News, the New Bedford Standard Times, and the Fall River Herald News are all owned by this evil company. Their attitude seems to be to lay off people, run smaller papers, and so on. And they don't cover nearly as much. They do a remarkable job with the staffs that they have, but the staffs are so reduced. And the company's interested, obsessed with making money. And I think maybe they ought to try something different, which is to improve the quality of the paper and add some staffers and take as a model. They can't be the Washington Post or the New York Times, but those papers are successful. And maybe they know something, and maybe the owners of these papers should try trying to go for quality instead of just decimating them.
Thank you. That's political columnist for a long time at the Providence Journal, Charlie Bakst. Thank you very much. At MC Bakst on Twitter, but he'll tell you he's more of a Facebook guy. So definitely connect with him on Facebook.
I have 3,000 followers on there. It's amazing.
I'm one of them. I'm one of them, Charlie.
But I must say I am disturbed to hear that there isn't a political columnist anymore. How
Right.
local papers love
I used
political
to be
columnists.
there, and we had a circulation of like 200,000 on Sundays and nearly that much during the week. And people used to, there were people who would go down to the printing plant on Saturday nights to get the copy of the Providence Journal ahead of time. Oh, what's going to be in the paper? And I don't think you see that anymore. And the deadlines are so early. They ran a notice in the paper on Monday or Tuesday saying we don't look for any election results in the Wednesday paper. We're not going to have them because the deadlines are so early. And I think, maybe they should explain to people why the deadlines are so early. And the other thing is, if you have deadlines, you make the deadlines so you can change them for, have some malleability on a big occasion like this.
Sure. Let's go to Parker for your final thoughts.
I would echo what Katie had said just about, transparency and, a lot of what we've done recently, it's sort of become a part of probably TV journalism, is showing our viewers the steps that we've taken to vet these stories, the steps that we've taken to try to get their questions answered, calling officials, emailing officials, showing up in person. We've tried to do a better job of explaining that, just we didn't take no comment and just let it lie there. We actually did a little bit more in showing you the process and how this all works. But as Dyana said earlier, in our role as a watchdog, I mean, one of the best compliments I can get from the subject of an I-Team story is, Parker, I think you were fair. And that's the goal. That's the goal, and that's the standard of what we do.
Thank you. Our guest, Parker Gavigan, who you can follow on Twitter at NBC10_Parker. Dyana, over to you for your final thoughts.
Well, I will say that I get a lot of parents and kids asking me if I would recommend they go into journalism today, because journalists have taken such a beating. And my reaction is always yes, yes, yes. We need journalists. They can change the world. I think great reporters have changed the world. Jim was one of them. I think that there's some work that we as journalists, or former old-time journalists like me, need to do, though. I think we've got to really work hard to fight back against this kind of attack and this lack of trust that has kind of perpetuated many parts of our culture. And I would say that I also think that in listening to this panel, I think that journalists need to do more self-examination. I think we all have to understand that we have biases, and nobody is totally unbiased. And I think the first way to be unbiased in our reporting is to acknowledge that we have it and then kind of fight against it and really police each other and kind of help the public understand that, as you guys have said. But I think the bottom line that I want people to take away from this is that political reporting is really exciting and really great, and investigative reporting is really a call that has made our country, our state, our local towns much, much better places to be.
Thank you. A great way to end an extraordinary panel. Thank you to everybody. And please follow Dyana on Twitter as well. And thank you all for being here. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jen Riley, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Rhode Island.
Appreciate this, and thank you to our panelists and all of you who joined us for this evening's event. My sincere thanks to Dyana and Charlie and Katie, Parker, and Dan for doing this and taking the time to share their thoughts with us for this Taricani lecture. I also want to thank Sri for his wonderful moderation of all 3 virtual Taricani events that we've held in the last few months. And thanks also need to go to the Harrington team who are behind the scenes making these things all come together. And last but not least, I want to give my very heartfelt thanks to Lori White Taricani and the friends of Jim Tarakan, who helped to establish this lecture series, which we will be bringing back to you in spring 2021. This lecture series is going to become a central Harrington School of Communication and Media event on the vital importance of the First Amendment and the press to our democracy that we will be bringing every spring going forward. We welcome your support for this lecture series. The Taricani Lecture Series, you can be part of ensuring Jim Tarakani's legacy continues here at URI, in the state of Rhode Island, and beyond. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the Taricani virtual events.